Again, welcome to all. I invited some of you very specifically because I know that you're working in the international sphere, and then others who have joined, welcome to you. If you're working in the international world or are interested in it, I really look forward to your ideas and thoughts. So in terms of context, we've had a lot of activity in the last decade in particular. It really ramped up through the International Polar Year. The IPY had a data component to it. We established, data policies and so on. Following IPY, there have been a number of various international activities. There have been a couple of Polar Data Forum meetings, one in Tokyo and then one in Waterloo that we co-hosted in 2015. And at that meeting, I think we had about 110 people from around the world get together to talk about data management for the polar regions. Data, and that's everything from, data collection and, archiving right through to visualization, through to the politics of data, through to policy and so on. So when I say data management, I'm talking about a very broad definition of all that entails. So those meetings have been very, very good in terms of establishing, what the opportunities are, what some of the issues are that we're facing. There was a meeting last November in Italy that the Arctic Data Committee and about 12 other partners hosted on interoperability, which was one of the key issues identified, at the two polar data forums. So we've had a lot of discussion around data issues, and we have a really good sense, I think, of some of the challenges that we have. But what's changed, I think, very recently over the last few years in particular is that we have more and more resources available to us. So about 18 years ago when I first got into the polar data game, it was very, very hard to find any funding to fund a polar data initiative. There are a few data centers out there, but trying to get projects going where it was really challenging. That started to really change through the International Polar Year, and since then. And now we're seeing actually some very, very large projects starting up, both in the United States, or sorry, not both, but in the US, in Canada, in Europe, in Asia, et cetera. So we have a great issue now, or a great problem in a sense, is we have resources. Where we are still challenged, I think, or where we have some work to do is how do we coordinate as an international community around those resources and ensure that we're being effective and efficient in using those resources. And everyone I speak to, I do a fair bit of this work trying to convene these discussions internationally, and everyone I'm talking to really does want to do that. But there are practical issues of just, knowing what's happening as well as trying to figure out how, in a practical sense, to work together. So that's sort of the background. I'm just trying to move my screen here. There we go. So more specifically, at the end of June, the Sustaining Arctic Observing Networks had a retreat in Italy. There were a number of US representatives there, as well as folks from Canada, from Europe, Asia, et cetera. And one of the things I was asked at that meeting was to sort of talk about, what a work plan for Arctic data and observing would be. And my statement was, we would have great difficulty doing that without all of these resourced efforts around the table, or at least some representation of these various resourced efforts, to first of all see, what's already happening, to see what's planned in those projects, and, where there might be gaps. So there happened to be an NSF program manager there, and so he pointed us to the workshop program at NSF. And I, along with Colleen Strawhacker, who's on the call, and Mary Beth Murray, who used to be at UAF but is now at University of Calgary, on very short notice, just over a week, submitted a proposal for a workshop, and were successful at that. So we have some funding available to bring together people to have this more detailed discussion about resources and how to move forward. We want to really focus on coordinating, existing or soon to be initiated funded activities. I mean, ideas are great, and I think those are a big part of the conversation. and those have been happening at these other workshops I mentioned. But here the idea was to bring together these projects that are resourced, obviously with input and so on from those who are not resourced but are doing work in this area, or maybe they're resourced in a research capacity, don't actually work with a data center. But the idea is to be very pragmatic in moving forward. And of course, data sharing and interoperability is sort of at the core of what was discussed in the proposal. In September 16 to 18, 2017, so a little less than 2 weeks ago, we brought together a number of people that are involved in Arctic data at the Arctic Data Committee annual meeting, and as well as people who are engaged in Antarctic data. So we had close to 40 people, I think, from both groups, and I think just over 30 who were with the Arctic, although some people were jumping back and forth because they do both, as many centers do. So one of the days, the 18th, we brought together a joint meeting of both committees, and we talked about things of joint interest. And this meeting and just the general idea of working together was was the main topic for the morning. So following some discussion, and we got a pretty significant buy-in. And so these are the people that were engaged in the conversation either at the meeting a couple of weeks back or in the initial meeting back in June. It does omit a few people because I wasn't sure if it was appropriate. Example, Mark Stieglitz, who's with us from NSF, was on the call, but as a funder, along with same with Will Ambrose, who used to be with NSF and funded the workshop. They've been involved, but more from a funder's perspective. So these are some of the people who were directly involved in the conversation, have indicated that they would be interested in and would contribute resources to not only attending the meeting, but preparation for the meeting, and then working on some sort of what we'll call maybe interoperability experiment or some sort of focused case study following the meeting after the planning is done. So we talked quite a bit on the 18th about determining a focused case study. This, I think, will be a challenge, but it's necessary, and really put a lot of emphasis on the idea of focused. A number of participants there talked about the idea of using meteorological or MET observations as a key focus sort of data type. And we had groups like the WMO representation there, Global Cryosphere Watch, and some people who are with MET services, so that wasn't a surprise. We had some other people talk about, making some sort of link to existing terrestrial networks, whether that be the Global Terrestrial Network for Permafrost or Interact and so on. We also identified that it's going to be very challenging to come up with a focused case study because it's, inclusiveness is always desired, but scoping is key. So if we're trying to be all things to all people and include everything, I think it may be, as some maybe past efforts where we tried to do this sort of thing but haven't had a focus, haven't worked as well. So we're really going to have to, I think about this also as iterative. We talked about the idea of maybe doing this, and if it worked well with a focused area or a focused study, we would then try to do it maybe again annually or biannually or whatever people decided was an appropriate sort of temporal scale. The other challenge, of course, and I think one of the core reasons for this meeting right now, is that if we were to invite everyone, even just involved in MET observations, we would have into the hundreds of people involved. If you think about all the data centers, the various government agencies, and so on and so forth, and we won't really be able to move forward in a practical way. So one of the things discussed is that whether it be major initiatives or it be national representation, we would have to in some way have representatives who would sort of come to the table. They would work with their communities, whether that be national communities, or in the case of WMO, they would work with the MET services and bring to the table, a clear idea of the resources available, not only monetary, but data, and then the mandates and interests that they have. So that will be a challenge, but I think it'll be necessary. And one of the things I've talked about with folks from IARPIC over time And also at the meeting on the 18th was I would see IARPIC as a key component of that. I think it would be a very good platform that would allow us to reach out within the US community and then have IARPIC representation. We also identified a group in Canada that's doing the same sort of thing called CCADI, and a polar data workshop that happened in May where there's about 60 or 70 sort of different partners there. And what we would do is have them come to send a representative to the table. Global Cryosphere Watch would send a representative. And now, happily, the European Union folks have just created a group called the EU Cluster, something along those lines. So I think they have 8 different Horizon 2020 projects that have been funded, including Intaros and EU PolarNet, et cetera. So they are organizing themselves regionally, and they would then send 1 or 2 representatives to the table rather than somebody from each one of those projects. So the question I have here, and where I wanted to get some dialogue going, is first of all, just what do you think about the idea of engaging in such a meeting? I think I may have mentioned, if I didn't, we would be looking at probably April or May of next year. The idea would be to have it before the Davos meeting, the Arctic and Antarctic Week Polar 2018, which is in June. And then we've also had some very good initial conversations with people organizing the next Arctic Science Ministerial about including the results of this effort in some way in the next Arctic Science Ministerial. So that's the sort of the timing of it, and I want to just get feedback from folks on the phone or on their internet connection as to thoughts about the idea in general, and then about how we might organize ourselves nationally.